Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate today's event, the Definitive Ransomware Prevention and Recovery Checklist, brought to you by our sponsors, Huntress and Keeper Security. Before we start today's two-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. And each of today's two sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. Following today's event, we will be giving away a selection of prizes in a random drawing. But you must stay on till the end for a chance to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. We also have several upcoming training events, both virtual and in person, to further your professional development. For more information, check out the Audience Resource Center on the right-hand side of your console. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, Huntress and Keeper Security, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank Huntress and Keeper Security for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's event, featuring Alan Liska, an intelligence analyst and solutions architect at Recorded Future. He has worked as both a blue and red teamer for the intelligence community and the private sector. Over the past 15 plus years, he's seen firsthand the damage ransomware attacks can cause, and he knows how the bad actors operate and communicate. A favorite guest on PBS, CNN, and others, it's no wonder he's known as the ransomware sommelier. Alan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thanks, David. And I always love doing these sessions with you. I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. And I hope we come up with a lot of questions, because these are really, really good sessions to attend, and they're always useful, and I try and hopefully provide useful content. So this quote is probably overused in cybersecurity, but it really does apply to ransomware, in that everybody thinks they have a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And ransomware is that ultimate punch in the mouth. I was talking to a small hospital out in the Midwest the other day. I was talking to their CISO, and they'd been hit with ransomware a couple of years ago. And one of the things that they had planned before they got hit was how long it would take to recover. And they, one of the bigger hospitals in the area had gotten hit, and they were able to recover within 5 days. So this guy had told his leadership, it'll probably take us about 5 days to recover. Turned out it took them more than 2 months to recover, because what they thought they had in place wasn't actually in place. And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about how ransomware can hit you unawares, and how what you may be planning for recovery may not work. But we're also going to talk a little bit about what you should be thinking about to better prepare for a ransomware attack, and what you should have in place that's going to help keep you safe. I can't go over everything in 30 minutes. I wish I could. I couldn't go over everything in 24 hours. I wish that was possible. But I want to give you some things to start thinking about, and some of the basics that you kind of need to cover. And this is really what we're going to be looking at is information sharing, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, patching, endpoint detection and response, backups and encryption, and then tabletops to kind of test that. Now, you'll notice none of this is me saying you need the latest whiz-bang AI-powered thingamabob from whatever vendor. We're really going to focus on covering the basics, because the basics will help keep you safer than all of the cool new whiz-bang things. And the whiz-bang things don't work unless you have the basics covered. So, it's sort of the old adage, you've got to walk before you can run. You've got to cover the basics before you can add the cool new thing and have it be effective. And what I mean by the basics are sort of the three areas that ransomware actors go after in terms of how they can gain access to networks. That is, you have good asset management, good identity management, and good data management, right? Those three things, if you're doing those three things, you're going to be able to stop most ransomware attacks. By asset management, I mean you need to know what systems you have in your network and in your cloud, what software is running on them, where they're located, what's open and closed to the internet, etc. Identity management, need to know, who all the people in your network are, what systems they should be asking, what systems should be talking to each other and not talking to each other. And then data management, where is your data and how is it secured, both in your network, in your cloud, in your partners' networks, and in your partner's cloud. Because data theft is such an important part of a modern ransomware attacks, that data management component is really important, because the ransomware actor doesn't care where they get your data from. If it's got your name on, you're the one that's going on the extortion site. You're the one that's getting called by the Wall Street Journal saying, hey, what happened? Did you get hit by a ransomware attack? And you may have no idea. So you need to understand where and how your data is, and if data does suddenly appear, where that data came from, so you can talk to your vendors and find out what happened and understand and get on top of that. So we're going to start with multi-factor authentication. I think everybody at this point has heard of multi-factor authentication. It's been drilled into your head, but stolen identities is one of the most common ways for ransomware actors or their initial access brokers to gain access to networks. Simply put, there are millions of stolen credentials from organizations around the world that are readily available. And while it's important to keep up whenever you do have credentials leaked, it's also just as important to make sure that you have multi-factor authentication enabled wherever you can, but especially on anything external facing. There are so many ransomware attacks that I see that start with a leaked credential that was used to get into a firewall or a VPN that didn't have multi-factor authentication enabled. So you've made it easier for the bad guy to basically walk into your network. And so anything that's external facing should have multi-factor authentication enabled on it, but you should also be monitoring for leaked and stolen credentials. And one of the best services for that is Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned? There's a free version, but even the versions that cost are fairly affordable. And basically what it looks for is leaked credentials on any underground forum or any large data leak. It alerts you on them and allows you to proactively change those passwords, get those passwords changes, get that access updated if needed. And that means even for accounts that are no longer active in the network. So again, I see this time and time again. We saw this just last year with a relatively big breach where the bad guys found a stolen credential. It was from an employee who was no longer at the company, but they had and they'd removed their access from the domain controller, but not from the VPN. So the bad guy was still able to log into the VPN and start the process of carrying out the ransomware attack. So even if you see, credentials leaked from employees that haven't been there for 2 years, is a good time to audit to make sure they've actually been removed from everything. Because unfortunately, our offboarding processes are often flawed, and we miss places where we should remove credentials and we don't. So enable multi-factor authentication, but also monitor for leaked credentials and take action when you find one. Network segmentation is another one. And again, this is one of those that is not a tool or a thing that you need to buy. It's just planning out your network. A lot of our networks grow organically. Like, you start as a small business, you get bigger and bigger, and you don't kind of plan out how you're doing that. But network segmentation can be really important because it can limit the scope and damage of a ransomware attack. So a ransomware attacker gets into one part of the network and they're not able to jump over to another part. Now, some of that is made harder by Active Directory. Generally, if you have one domain controller in your network, and once the ransomware actors get onto that, which is what they're going to go after, they're always going to go after the domain controller, then they can get access to everywhere. And setting up Active Directory for us is really hard and really complicated, but if you can do it, you're going to keep yourself safer. Again, this is something I see especially in ransomware attacks against local governments, where they'll land in the ransomware actor will land in like the finance department, but because it's a completely flat network, they're able to hit the police station, the fire station, the courts, and encrypt everything across the board, and so effectively shutting down the whole government. Well, there's really no reason that the finance network should be able to see or talk to the court network or the police network or the fire department network, and so that needs to be better isolated, and so you can so that you can limit the scope of the attack. So if something does go wrong, your defenses fail, at least only part of your network is disrupted. Patch systems, right? Including maintaining the security of operating systems, application firmware in a timely manner. You want to consider, of course, using a centralized patch management system, but more importantly, a risk-based strategy to drive your patch management program. So, and the reason that we talk about this in terms of a risk-based strategy, there are going to be 45,000 new CVEs this year before the end of the year. It may even be closer to 50,000 at the rate that we're going. I get that it is really hard to patch everything. And that's what everybody will tell you, right? They'll stand up here at a webinar or on a stage and they'll say, well, you got to patch all the things. Well, yeah, I know you got to patch all the things. You don't have the time to patch all the things as much as you want to, right? But the bad guys move very quickly in exploiting vulnerabilities. And so what you have to do is balance what the risk is to your organization and and prioritize patching those systems that are the biggest risk. So, for example, ransomware groups really love to exploit SSL VPNs. Anytime a new SSL VPN vulnerability is announced, especially a remote code executable one that has no touch, so they can easily scan it and exploit it just with some Python scripts, within 24 hours, they're starting to scan, and generally within 48 hours, they've already started exploiting. But our time to patch is generally weeks, if not months. Well, there's a big disconnect there. And so what you want to look at is prioritizing patching those systems that are most likely to be exploited by ransomware actors and patching those quickly. And then for the things that are less of a risk of being used by ransomware actors or nation states or whatever your concern is, then you can put those on a more regular patch cadence so that you have the time to do it, because you've protected against the big things. And again, one of the resources that I like to refer people to, and the link is here, is the CISA Kev list. Kevin is not the name of the guy who maintains it. It's the known exploited vulnerabilities list. And what that is it's a free resource from CISA, and it's anytime that they see a new vulnerability being widely exploited by cybercriminal groups, they put that on that list. That list is something you can then pull down and compare it against your technology and say, hey, this thing's being widely exploited. This is what we can prioritize patching. And again, it's a great free resource from CISA that will allow you to better manage the risk of your vulnerability. And, David, you and I have been doing this a long time, and we have been conditioned to think of the CVSS score, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, as the risk identifier, right? So if something's a 10 or a 9.8 or a 9.5, that's what you need to patch immediately because, it's got a high number on it. But the CVSS score is actually not a risk identifier. It's a severity identifier. But if something is a 10, but it's not being exploited in the wild, you have a little more time than something that may have a CVSS score of 8, but is being exploited in the wild. And so we need to get away from using CVSS score as a stand-in for risk and actually look at what the risk is. And so, like the CISA KEB list is a great way to do that for companies that are just getting started. But there are other things that are out there as well. I'm sure if you have Qualys or you have Rapid7, they have the same kind of actual risk scoring, and that you can use that to prioritize so that not everything becomes a 10 that needs to be patched immediately because you simply don't have the time to do all of that. And then EDR is the other thing that I recommend. I know a lot of organizations, small organizations, really can't afford or, it's not cost effective for them to use EDR, but if you can, you should absolutely use it. There are real advantages to endpoint detection and response in terms of what it can look for versus a traditional antivirus. In fact, there are some ransomware groups that, for example, won't attack a system that has CrowdStrike on it because CrowdStrike is harder for them to defeat. So, but not only that, EDR allows you to customize the detections for your network. So if there are certain things you're looking for, if there are certain things that the bad guys do, certain tools they use or whatever, your EDR allows you to specifically look for those things. So it can be really advantageous. And even if you can't afford a license directly, there are often managed detection and response providers. Arctic Wolf is an example of that, who can provide that for you, and they maintain the license and everything for you. So whenever possible, try and use EDR because that is going to give you a better advantage in terms of fully understanding what the threat is and detecting more. Now, of course, the counter to that is you have to have the staff and the people in place that when your EDR detects things, that you can respond and you can actually deal with the issues in a timely fashion. Because your EDR can alert you all you want. If you're not going to be responsive quickly, you're still going to hit with ransomware. So having those alerts just sitting in your SIM doing nothing, unfortunately, doesn't do anybody any good. And again, that's where some of these outsourced managed detection and response services can be very handy for, because they can handle a lot of that for you, and generally in a relatively cost-effective manner versus, staffing a SOC full-time or even part-time. And of course, backups. Backups are definitely not a panacea for protecting are not a panacea for protecting from ransomware, but they give you options for recovery. Now that's if you've done backups correctly. So there's a thing with backups called a 3-2-1 rule. So you're supposed to have 3 copies in at least 2 different media formats, one of which is offline, or at least not readily accessible. So, having your backup stored on a hard drive that's accessible by the bad guys means that your backups are going to be encrypted during a ransomware attack. What you want is backups in some sort of immutable drive. That includes the tape drives. I've seen a number of ransomware attacks where they've got an old tape drive that they actually test, the backups still work, and to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen a ransomware actor able to encrypt tape. So that is an option. One thing to be aware of, though, when you're doing, and we're going to talk a little bit about this when we talk about the tabletop exercises. Keep in mind that most people, when they talk about disaster recovery, talk about disaster recovery for a single machine or single server. Ransomware attack is very different. So if your backup, especially from the immutable drive, whatever that is, takes 6 hours, that's what it takes to restore it. That's 6 hours for one machine. Now imagine you have 200 machines that need to be restored from backup in your network. That is going to take you a lot longer. And often you can't restore more than one at a time because network speed, fabric, etc., just won't allow it. So you need to understand what the process and what the time involved in restoring dozens or hundreds of machines from that backup, and think about ways that you can improve and speed up your backup as you're doing that. So having backups is important because it gives you options, but they have to be done right so that the ransomware actors can encrypt them and make your life more difficult. And if you're thinking about recovery, think about how long it's going to take you to restore every machine or most of the machines in your network. And all of that means that you have to have a ransomware incident response plan, and you have to review that plan. Testing your assumptions is so incredibly important. Unfortunately, too often, the security team is isolated from the rest of the network. I wish that wasn't the case, but we are. And the rest of the organization, I'm even speaking in network terms, not in people terms. The security team is isolated from the rest of the organization. And so there may be assumptions in your ransomware incident response plan that make sense on paper, and then you go to implement them and you find out, oh no, that actually isn't the case. And so testing your response plan before there's a ransomware attack is really important, because you want to make sure that if you think that the IT team will do this during an attack or during a recovery process, that they actually know that that's what they're supposed to be doing, or that they are actually able to do that. They may tell you, no, actually we've outsourced that. Okay, well, great. Let's bring that person in and make sure that we have all of the right people on the call. So setting up at least an annual ransomware incident response tabletop exercise can be really important, and you need to bring all the different business units together so that everybody understands, because when the ransomware attack happens, it's going to be all hands on deck, and you don't want anybody to be surprised by their role. And the nice thing is, if you do this ahead of time, you can then have time to work on the flaws in your system, on where your assumptions fail. And then you can update that. That incident response plan should be a living document. And while it should be a living document, you should also have an offline copy of it, because, it would kind of suck to get hit with ransomware and have your incident response plan be one of the things that's encrypted. So make sure that you have an updated version of that offline somewhere so that you can refer to it in case things happen. But you do want to make sure that you are constantly updating it as things change, as processes change, as policies change, as your organization expands. You want to keep making those changes to it and continuously updating it. And David, I'm a big advocate of this. If you're going to bring everybody together, don't just serve them cold pizza. Get a nice lunch to go along with that. Because when you have a nice lunch and you feed everybody very well and make sure they're comfortable and happy, they're going to want to do it again next year, because you're going to have fond memories of it. and they're going to want to come back. So just keep that in mind. Break the budget a little bit on that. If your boss complains, tell them I said I approve the expense. Again, run your assumptions, run the tabletop exercises, bring the relevant teams together to test new plan, and make the adjustments as needed. This should never be stale. This should always be new and current based on the current information. And don't be afraid to invite your vendors to these. Vendors love to come to these because they have the latest updated information. They have the latest configuration updates, and they can help contribute to this. And you're going to want to call on them probably during a ransomware attack. So bring your vendors into there. And then you've now solved the lunch problem because the vendors will compete with each other to pay for lunch and provide lunch. So you'll get a really nice lunch out of it. And so just, again, bring in everybody that's relevant. Make sure that you're running through your tests and adjusting. And, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so that's kind of all I have for today. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, David.
You bet. We have several questions from the audience, and let's just dive right into them. First come, first serve. So if you want to follow along, these will be read from the bottom up. And here's a question from Lynn James in the audience. How can organizations proactively identify potential ransomware threats before they escalate into a full-blown attack?
So it's interesting, and this is a good question, Lynn. We see a lot of the same tools used over and over again. I know Huntress is speaking later. Huntress on their website, they've got a lot of really good blogs where they talk about some of the early indicators of ransomware attacks. So while we talk about a ransomware attack as a single event, it's often multiple events that are that come together to form one attack. So you have an initial access broker who gets the access, leaves their tools behind, and then hands that over, or more appropriately sells it to the ransomware operator that carries out the attack. So if you can stop that initial access by looking for the tools that they use, things like Redline Stealer is a common precursor to a ransomware attack because a lot of initial access brokers like it. So if you can look for that kind of malware, and again, that's where your EDR can really help you find those loaders, find those info stealers, and stop that part of the attack, then the rest of it never happens. So what we're doing is we're proactively trying to get to the attack earlier. And that's, that again, that's what you look for. Huntress Labs has a lot of really good information on some of those, early ransomware indicators. I also really like the DFIR report. That's a really cool service. They've got a bunch of honeypots set up all over the world, and they record the attacks as they come through and list the tools that are used by the attacker. So again, you can pull information from there, and you can feed that into your EDR, and your EDR can look for those kind of events.
All right. That was a great answer. Here's a question from Matthew. Does multi-factor offset SSL VPN vulnerabilities?
Unfortunately not, because when somebody exploits the SSL VPN, they generally gain access at the system level, so the system account level. So they don't need to authenticate at that point because they've gained access and they essentially have admin control or some system level control of that machine, which they can then use that to get the account information that they need. So just having MFA is not going to protect you from SSL VPNs, which is SSL VPN vulnerabilities, which is why it's important to have MFA and to patch. You want to do both, especially on anything external facing.
Okay, great. Here's a follow-up question from Matthew in the audience. Do you think immutable cloud storage is safe enough, or do you think we need offline media like tape?
Oh, no. Immutable cloud storage is perfectly safe. Absolutely. I think that that's a good practical solution for a lot of organizations. The caveat I will give to that is, well, there are two caveats. The first is, again, how fast can you restore after recovery? The other thing you have to be careful of is, like, the ransomware actors are aware of people using what's supposed to be immutable cloud storage. So, like, we saw this with Dropbox a few years back, where what the ransomware actors would do is they knew that Dropbox only kept 11 versions of whatever you had stored there, and so they would overwrite them 12 times, so that even though things were stored in Dropbox, they were now, they were now basically useless. Dropbox has since fixed that, so I'm not slagging on Dropbox here, but you just have to be careful that when we think it's immutable, it really is immutable, and it can't be changed by the ransomware actor.
All right. Next question in the console. We are trying to get more serious about ransomware protection. Where should we start?
To me, the easiest way to start is learning your network first. So anything else in terms of a recommendation relies on, again, that triangle that I showed, having those three basics covered. So understanding what your weaknesses are internally goes a long way to being able to protect yourself, because then you can focus on the areas that you've identified as weaknesses. Now, it may help to bring in a third party to help you with that analysis. Like, if you don't feel like you are qualified to do that, you may want to bring in a third party who can do, whether it's a pen test or whether it's a more invasive audit of what your network and practices look like. Absolutely, you can do that. But whatever it is, you want to start internally and then build internally to externally.
All right. Here's a question from Kimehito in the audience. What is the first thing to address when infected with ransomware?
Oh, that's a really good question. So again, if you've got a plan in place, then what you'll probably do is you'll probably have a breach coach, and that breach coach is, going to activate that chain of, okay, let's get all the people involved that need to be involved. Depending on what your plan is, your first thing may be a few things. You may first want to try and contain the ransomware. So you've been hit with ransomware, it hasn't fully infected your network. How can you stop it? And that's up to and including, do I start pulling wires? Like, do I shut everything down to make sure that it can't be infected? Like, because you've got to move fast because the ransomware is spreading in your network. You may need to call in your incident response company, say, hey, we're under attack by ransomware. Can we get somebody here quickly? You may need to call your insurance company. If you have cyber insurance, and cyber insurance is going to be the one who provides you with an incident responder and everything else you need, you may need to put the call into the insurance company. But again, ideally, as part of your ransomware incident response plan, you've identified a breach coach, and that breach coach is going to do an assessment of the situation, see where you stand, and then take whatever the appropriate action is. And that's going to vary depending on how far into the ransomware attack you are, how prepared you are internally, what external resources you need to bring in.
Okay, great. Looks like we have time for one more question. This comes from Chris in the audience. Would you suggest a zero trust approach?
Yeah, everything that we've talked about here is some of the basic tenets that are built into zero trust. Absolutely. Zero trust is really just about least privilege, right? Don't give people access to things they need. One of the things that I see all the time is so many networks make local admin access available to everybody, and local admin access makes the job easier for the initial access broker and the ransomware actor, and so don't do that. Now, again, of course, any jackass over here can sit and tell you don't give everybody local admin access, but the reality is that if you take away local admin access, you're probably going to have a whole lot of bad employees. And so it's unfortunately not something where you can just yank it away and everything will be fine, but you should be moving to removing local admin access for everybody. You should be removing, you should be moving toward application allow list, so people can't just randomly install whatever they want to install. And all of the zero trust and the least privilege things that are required, they take a lot of work, but if you can do them, yes, it absolutely helps improve your ability to defend against ransomware. It makes the recovery generally easier. It makes your organization more resilient, which is obviously the ultimate goal of zero trust.
All right. Well, looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Alan, for a great presentation and answering all those questions from our audience.
Fantastic. Always happy to do it. This was another wonderful session, and it's always great to hang out with you, David.